Okay, good morning, Merry Christmas to you all, and hope you guys had a good night. Okay, hey, look, I wanted to go on and make a couple of videos about my beloved Marine Corps. Now, true, if once you spend all these years in the Marine Corps and then you retire or execute your EAS, then all of a sudden you're out and you're thinking, oh man, that was a lot of time. And the Marine Corps doesn't even skip a beat. I'm going to tell you right now. I am going to throw out some acronyms at you, explain a few things over the next series just for giggles, right? Just to give you an idea. Let's go over the ranks real quick. Now, in the Marine Corps, you have everything. If you ever hear a Marine say E1, E2, E3, E stands for enlisted. All right, so you have your enlisted ranks, then you have your warrant officer ranks, which those pay grades are W1, W2, W3, and then you have your officer ranks. Those are O1, O2, O3, all the way up to the top. All right, so if you say, oh, what rank were you? Say E3. Now, in the Marine Corps, you get in trouble for that. You are not a pay grade. You have a rank. So if you're an E3, you're a lance criminal. Or a lance, it's a lance corporal. There's a lot of terms because the Marine Corps has more lance corporals in it than any other rank. Lance corporals and gunnies at one point for all weird things. So you have private. That's a slick sleeve or nothing on their collar. They're private. Recruits are private, but you're a recruit because you get paid at a lower rank when you're in recruit training. So you got private. And then you got PFC, which is private first class, and that's just one hash or one chevron, right, on your collar. Now, when they say, oh, you're getting your landing gear, they put a cross rifles underneath that one chevron, and you become a lance corporal. Now, a lance corporal is called, we have a lot of terminology. We call them lance coconuts, lance criminals. You get your landing gear because the cross rifles, you know, you have this chevron with cross rifles. Looks like kind of like a plane or some kind, I guess. And I tell you, lance corporals is really weird because you'll see these like 3-4 year lance corporals. You know that they did something wrong. But you have all these lance corporals. And then after that, you go into the NCO ranks. Now, the NCO, that's terminology, stands for non-commissioned officer. So you got corporal, which is an E4 pay grade. And then those are all from private to PFC to lance corporals, an automatic after a certain amount of time in service and time in grade, and then lance corporal, and then you get into corporal, and they go off of what they call a cutting score. And cutting score is it's a score that takes in a whole bunch of things you do from rifle score to PFT score to PFT, that's private first, or PFT is a physical fitness test. So you take all these scores and they put them together and do this math formula, and they come up with a number. And your time in grade and time in service is also put in there. And so then you get this cutting score, and then the cutting score is based on your MOS. Another acronym stands for military occupational specialty. So I may be an infantry or an 0311. An 0311 is actually a rifleman in the infantry, and an 0341 is a mortarman. So even though we're all encompassing in the grunt, which is the infantry, we're all there, but we have different jobs. So I may have a lower cutting score to get the corporal on an 0311, and 0341 may have a higher cutting score. So your buddies that you went through boot camp together and all that stuff, and you got promoted along the way, now all of a sudden this guy's a corporal, and this guy has to wait another year or so because the cutting score isn't where he needs to be, right? It's just the way it is, and it's across the entire board with all the different MOSs. All right, so I don't know how they're promoting the Army, but I do know they have specs, and Spec 4, which is a specialist, and 4 is still an E4 pay grade like our corporals, but they're really not considered an NCO. And so when you get the sergeant, an E5, now sergeant is the same in both Army and the Marine Corps as an E5. Those are your senior NCOs. Those are your 3 stripes, right? And in the Air Force and the Navy, it starts going, it gets a little bit confusing, because in the Air Force, an E5 is a staff sergeant. In the Marine Corps, your staff sergeant rank is an E6. So they're one step low, and then after staff sergeant, they go into a different name. But it's all the same. So if you're an E5 pay grade in the Navy, Air Force, Army, Marine, Coast Guard, if you whatever they call that rank, if you're an E5, you're all getting the same base pay, and it's determined by your time in service. So if you have an E5 that's been in 8 years and you have an E5 that's been in 6 years, the guy that's been in 8 years is a senior. Well, he's senior in service, which means nothing other than pay grade. So he'll get more money than the guy that's been in 6 years. Now, where the seniority comes is on equal levels. If you have 2 sergeants, one got promoted 1 month and the other one got promoted the next month, then now you have ones that were equal. You have the one that's been the sergeant the longest. He's number 1. He's senior to you. This gets confusing when you go to places like the drill instructor. So your drill instructor, you'll have a sergeant that's a strong, they call him a strong J, which is a strong junior. Back in the day, they used to call him a heavy. But he's the guy that stands, he's right-hand man to the senior drill instructor. So that guy may be a sergeant. Now, he may have 3 drill instructors underneath him, all at the rank of sergeant. But one of them may get promoted to staff sergeant because his MOS has different requirements. And because you have a primary MOS, which is like your specific MOS no matter where you go, because drill instructors, that's a secondary MOS and it's a required formal duty. So if you get you get promoted under your primary MOS. So if you're a drill instructor and you got these 3 sergeants and 1 sergeant's a strong J, and now 3 sergeants, and this guy doesn't have the time in service or the time in grade to be senior to this guy, but his MOS is promoting faster, and now he's in the zone for staff sergeant, they promote him to staff sergeant, and in the Marine Corps, rank always overrides everything, and rank has its privileges. So at some point, something needs to happen, but this staff sergeant has to move above this sergeant. So what they usually do is they move him to a different team that may have a staff sergeant as a senior and a staff sergeant as a strong J. Then they'll move him into that. Or they will leave the staff sergeant in that team with the idea that that strong J, who's a sergeant, is in charge of some specific things, and that staff sergeant becomes the trainee or the Padawan to the senior drill instructor, because as a rank of staff sergeant, he's going to have to move up and learn quickly because they got to give him his own senior spot. We call it being a black belt because they change the color of your belt into this black belt. When you're a junior drill instructor, you got a green belt. It's a cartridge belt that's all shined up. But when you're a drill instructor, when you're a senior drill instructor, you have a black belt, and it's just a black dress belt. And so you have a black belt, which means that you're senior drill instructor. We also refer to each other in the drill field as hats. Oh yeah, I was a hat over in San Diego. That means you were a drill instructor. We do that because we wear the campaign covers and we just say hat. Bad terminology in the Marine Corps, anything you put on your head's a cover. Unless it's a stocking hat, then it's a boggin. Terminology is everything in the Marine Corps. I'm going to tell you straight now. Now, when you get to the staff sergeant, we hold on E6, we say staff sergeant. We call each other staff sergeant. And then we call them staff sergeant. Like you lance corporal, hey, staff sergeant. You go in the Army, they just call them sergeant or sarge or something like that. When I went to jump school, which is an Army school, and I was a staff sergeant, I would refer to them because E7 in the Marine Corps is called a gunnery sergeant, and we can shorten that to gunny. But in the Army, it's sergeant first class. And I used to say, hey, staff sergeant, hey, sergeant first class. And I would use their entire rank. And sergeant first class once told me, he goes, every time I hear that, I think somebody's calling me to be in trouble. It's like your mother calling you by your full name. You know something's awry. Right? In the Army, if you go, hey, staff sergeant, then chances are you're about to get your ass chewed. But I did it all the time. And I had a staff sergeant get really, because he hated Marines, and he said, he says, hey, you call me sergeant. And I said, no, staff sergeant, why aren't you proud of your rank? Because him and I were the same rank. I said, why aren't you proud of your rank? You're a staff sergeant. And it caused the thing, and sergeant first class had to come over. And I mean, we didn't go like head to head, but I was being as respectful as I could. But I'm not going to let him get over on me any more than he would let me get over on him in the same situation. I'm calling you a staff sergeant because in my branch of service, that's what we do. And he was like, you're in an Army school, you'll call me sergeant because that's what we do. And I go, guess what? I'm still wearing the United States Marine Corps uniform. I'll call you a staff sergeant. So consequently, when I became a police officer years and years and years later, the sergeants, I would call them sergeant. And they would drive them crazy because they'd say, no, call me Sarge. Now, if you were an MP in the military and then you became a cop, and I'm talking in the Marine Corps, and then you became a police officer, those guys had no problem calling the sergeant Sarge. No problem whatsoever. I had never seen them struggle over that. The ones that actually were certified MPs, it was like they went from one room to another room. If you're talking in the military and they're an MP, they got out of the MP or retired as MP and then became a cop. To them, it was like, okay, different room, different uniform, and they went on. But with a Marine that was stuck on that, we had a problem and we struggled. But I never did call anybody in the police department Sarge. To me, that was disrespectful. The same thing on the drill field. As a drill instructor, the junior drill instructors will refer to the senior drill instructor as boss. Hey, boss. You'll see that across the board. Once you're even if you're a sergeant and you're one of these junior drill instructors, once you pushed a cycle or two with the senior and you're with him, and he's a staff sergeant, you'll refer to him as boss. B-O-S-S, boss. Hey, boss, I'm going to take the dinks. That's another term that we use for recruits. I'm going to take the dinks to chow now. Roger that. Well, in the police department, especially with the police departments where they come from sheriff's departments, where they start off in the jail and then they move to the streets and then they transfer over into the smaller police departments where I was, and it did not matter whether they were Marines, prior Marine MPs, or other branches of services. When you called them boss, they got really butthurt because boss was an acronym that prisoners called them guys, and I can't remember it all, but it was a derogatory terminology. It was an acronym, and so one Marine who told me, don't call us boss because that's a derogatory term. And I said, and so finally I asked him, I said, what are you talking about? He goes, into jails, they call the guards boss, and this is what it means. And I'm like, okay, and you don't like that? So you don't call the lieutenant, right? Because in the jails, those fools that congregate together have lieutenants. And so you don't call, well, that's different. See, they can't. With MPs, it's straight. All of their schools in the Marine Corps can transfer over to the civilian. In other words, once they're as a civilian police department, they can apply to, say, your state post, which is a POST. It's an acronym, stands for Police Officer Standard Training. They can take those certificates, apply to post to have them credited towards their post certificate, and they can advance from their to their intermediate and advanced post quicker. But if you're an infantry and you take all your schools, even over 20 years, and you give it to post, they're going to tell you, go pound sand. None of this stuff is police work. So then you have the MPs and the law enforcement. They'll say, well, we were Marines. Yeah, you graduated boot camp. That's about. So anyway, they'll tell you, oh yeah, I've been in law enforcement. If they 5 years in law enforcement or 10 years in civilian law enforcement, but they did 4 years as an MP in the Marine Corps, they add that and they'll say, oh, I've been in law enforcement for this number of years. I'm like, I thought you were a Marine for 4. Huh? And they'll say, well, you know, we were Marines, but yeah, they're a whole different animal. Anyway, first installment, we're up to gunnery sergeant, because then after gunny, it starts to get a little bit tricky, at least in the Marine Corps and what we call for them. But remember, when I was in, there was more lance corporals and gunnery sergeants. I don't know why gunnery sergeants, but more lance corporals and gunnery sergeants. In an infantry battalion, in each company, you only had one gunny, and he was usually the company gunny. Now, that's not true, because if you were in weapons company, that can be different. So if you're in a weapons company and you're in an 81 millimeter mortar platoon, that platoon sergeant billet is a gunnery sergeant, but it's an artillery gunnery sergeant, not a regular infantry guy. This guy comes over from artillery, and he sits there as that platoon sergeant, because 81 millimeter mortars are aligned and they aim, and there's a lot of similarities between artillery and mortars. So they need that FDC, which is a fire direction center. The FDC, we shorten it. That's that's the small group that actually tells the guns where to point and all that stuff. So you could, in a weapons company, you could very well have a gunnery sergeant, 2 gunnery sergeants, a company gunny and a gunny as a platoon sergeant in a mortar platoon. But occasionally you will see a gunnery sergeant as a platoon sergeant in one of the line companies, because he will get promoted to gunny, and they will stay there because they can do that. He's 0369, which is a platoon sergeant. Now, when you get into the other assets, your recon, force recon, and all that stuff, the billets start to change. All right, and what I mean by that is that your ranks will go higher because they have more senior guys there. So a platoon sergeant and I'm saying this generally, I know they call them different things, but a platoon sergeant in the infantry usually is a staff sergeant. In force recon, it's at least a gunnery sergeant, and but he has gunnies or very senior staff sergeants as his team leaders, and so it's a little bit different. In the Army, that's the scenario they have. Their staff sergeants are used differently than the Marine Corps uses their staff sergeants, and in the Navy, their first class petty officers, which are their E6s, are used differently than the Marine Corps uses their E6. I don't know how it is in the Air Force. I don't know what they do, but nevertheless, this is a confusion. Think about it, and I'm going to publicly put this out, and if somebody wants to comment on it, go ahead, man. But Marine Corps, 21 years, all right? Trained with a lot of different elements and the other branches of services. So if I misspoke, if I screwed it up, let me know. But I am right about MPs. I played around with them guys in the Marine Corps, and I served with them in law enforcement. I am spot on with the MPs. So if the MPs out there that see this, go ahead and take your shots. Anytime you give a lance corporal the authority to tell a a major to shut up and get out of his vehicle. Come on, man. We don't even do that on the guard. When we're standing guard on the area, we don't tell that. We create a different situation. Not bad. It's just their walking orders. That's just what they are. That's their MOS. That's how it functions. I can't say, it's not that it's bad or good. That's just the way it is. Anyway, I love the Marine Corps. I do. It does not love me. And the VA is something separate. And the VA does not like veterans. I'm going to tell you straight up. They are, I don't know, and a lot of them in the VA are veterans. And they just systemically, they do not like veterans. Anyway, let this stew in your head for a little bit.